The courtroom was filled with the kind of silence that clings to the walls, heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself remembered centuries of injustice. The polished wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of anxious bodies. People had gathered not just to witness a trial, but to witness what it meant to be black in a system that had never truly been built for them. At the center of it all stood Amara, a young black woman, tall and steady, though her heart thundered like a war drum in her chest. She had been raised to carry herself with dignity, to stand tall even when others tried to force her to kneel. That day, her dignity was being tested in the harshest of ways. Amara was not a criminal. She was a teacher and a mentor to children who looked up to her like a lighthouse in a storm. She was the woman who stayed late after school, helping a young boy learn to read so he wouldn't be swallowed by statistics. She was the one who bought notebooks out of her own pocket so that no child in her classroom had to feel the shame of having nothing to write on. She was a community leader, the kind of person who would rally her neighbors to clean up the park or organize food drives. Yet here she was, standing in a courtroom as a defendant, accused of disrupting public order during a protest where she had done nothing more than raise her voice against injustice. The prosecutor's words were sharp, designed to cut, designed to paint Amara not as who she was but as a threat. His voice carried an air of condescension, the tone of someone who believed they held power over truth itself. Amara kept her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was stronger than speaking, that her steady gaze and calm presence spoke volumes louder than arguments. Then it happened. As she turned slightly, her wrist brushing against the table where her lawyer sat, one of the officers standing nearby muttered something under his breath. The words were low, venomous, meant only for her. But Amara heard them, and so did the people in the gallery closest to her. She flinched, not from fear, but from the sting of disrespect. She turned her head, her eyes locking on the officer, and that was when another stepped forward. It was quick, brutal, and almost unbelievable. His hand rose and came crashing down across her face. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps filled the room. Someone cried out. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Amara's head turned with the force of the slap, but she did not fall. She stood there, her jaw tight, her eyes burning, not with tears, but with something far fiercer. Her lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting about assault, shouting about rights, shouting about the outrage of what had just occurred in plain sight. The judge, an older man who had spent years presiding over cases without ever questioning the foundations of the system he served, banged his gavel in vain. His voice cracked as he demanded order, but there was no order to be found. The people in the gallery erupted, voices rising like a tide, some shouting for justice, some frozen in disbelief. And Amara, she stood motionless, her hands at her sides, her breath steadying itself. She could feel the sting on her cheek, but she also felt something deeper awaken inside her. It was not just anger. It was something that reached back through generations, something carried in the marrow of her bones. It was the memory of ancestors who had been whipped, chained, silenced, but who had survived. It was the strength of her grandmother's prayers whispered over her as a child. It was dignity, unbroken and unyielding. She slowly turned back, her eyes locking on the officer who had struck her. He expected fear. He expected collapse. Instead, what he saw in her gaze made him shift uncomfortably, as though the weight of history itself stared back at him. The judge tried to continue, tried to sweep the moment under the rug, to treat it as though it was not an earthquake shaking the very foundations of his courtroom. He muttered about decorum and order, but his words rang hollow. Everyone in that room knew what they had witnessed. Everyone knew the line that had just been crossed. Then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, the bailiff, who had been standing silently by the judge's side, walked away from his post. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at the judge. He simply placed the judge's black robe onto the empty chair. The room went still. At first, no one moved. Not the judge, not the officers, not even Amara. But then the air seemed to shift, as though destiny itself whispered in her ear. Without a word, Amara stepped forward. Each step was deliberate, her heels clicking against the floor like a drumbeat, echoing through every corner of the chamber. The officer who had struck her instinctively moved to block her path, but something in her presence, something undeniable, forced him to step aside. She walked past him, past the prosecutor, past the gavel still trembling in the judge's hand, and she stopped before the seat of authority, the very chair from which justice had been so often misused and misnamed. Her hand hovered over the robe for just a moment. She could hear her mother's voice in her head. "Stand tall, Amara. Don't ever let them see you bow." And then she took the robe, lifting it as if it weighed 100 years of struggle. She draped it across her shoulders, and when she sat in that chair, the silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever known. It was not the silence of oppression, not the silence of fear. It was the silence of power reclaiming its rightful place. Her voice was calm when she finally spoke, but it carried like thunder. "You may have tried to silence me. You may have thought your hand could break me. But I am not here to be broken. I am here because justice has been denied for too long. And today, in this courtroom, we will speak the truth." The judge sat frozen, his authority crumbling in his own courtroom. The officers looked uneasy, shifting in their shoes. The gallery held its breath, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. In that moment, Amara was no longer just a defendant. She was every woman who had been silenced, every man who had been beaten, every child who had been told they did not matter. She was dignity in flesh, justice in motion, history in the making. And though no one knew what would come next, everyone in that courtroom understood one thing. The world had just shifted. The weight of the robe on Amara's shoulders felt heavier than any garment she had ever worn. It was more than cloth. It was more than authority. It was centuries of denied dignity, every silenced voice, every stolen breath pressing down upon her. Yet she carried it without trembling. She sat in the judge's chair with a posture so resolute that it seemed she had been born for it. The courtroom was still in shock. The judge, his gavel clutched but useless in his hand, sat frozen in disbelief. The officer who had struck her now looked unsettled, as if realizing the enormity of what he had done. The prosecutor stood rigid, his mouth half open, as though words had deserted him for the first time in his career. Amara spoke again, her voice calm yet ringing with undeniable force. "You have made a spectacle of justice," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "You struck me, thinking it would humiliate me. But all you revealed was the violence that hides beneath the robes of order." Her words cut deeper than any gavel could. A murmur ran through the gallery, people leaning forward, eyes wide, whispering to one another. Some nodded, tears brimming in their eyes, because they had waited their whole lives to hear such truth spoken aloud in a place of power. Image 14. The judge finally found his voice. "This is outrageous. You cannot." Amara raised her hand, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that enough is enough. "No. What is outrageous is the violence committed in this room. What is outrageous is a system that has permitted this for generations. You think this seat belongs only to those you select, but today it belongs to truth." Image 15. The officer who had slapped her shifted uncomfortably. His hand twitched at his side, as though still itching to reassert his control. But there was something in Amara's stillness that held him back, as if the power dynamic had inverted in a single heartbeat. Her lawyer, standing near the defense table, looked at her with awe. He had defended countless clients who had been chewed up by the system, but never had he seen one seize the narrative so completely, so fearlessly. The prosecutor tried again, his voice strained. "This is a mockery of the court." "No," Amara said firmly. "The mockery has always been the way this system pretends to be blind. Blind to truth, blind to humanity, blind to the cries of those crushed under its weight. Today, the blindfold is removed." A ripple of applause started from the gallery, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. The judge slammed his gavel, but the sound was drowned by the echo of clapping hands and the rising voices of people who had seen something impossible take place before their eyes. Amara let the applause wash over her, not as a performance, but as a recognition of something larger than herself. She knew she was speaking not just as Amara, but as every person who had been silenced, beaten, dismissed, and dehumanized in these halls. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the wooden desk before her. For too long, justice has been a stage play. Today, we tear down the set and show the world what lies behind it. Her words reached beyond the walls of the courtroom. News cameras, usually relegated to the back, zoomed in with fervor. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing history unfolding in front of them. The slap that had been meant to degrade her had instead become the spark of something revolutionary. The judge, red-faced, rose from his seat. "This is unlawful. This is... This is necessary," Amara interrupted, her voice steady. "Necessary for every child who has to be taught how to survive a police stop instead of how to dream. Necessary for every family that buries their loved one without answers. Necessary for every person who walks into a courtroom already guilty in the eyes of the world. If not here, then where? If not now, then when?" The room trembled with silence after her words, the kind of silence that comes not from fear, but from the gravity of undeniable truth. The officer who had struck her finally spoke, his voice uneven. "You don't belong in that seat." Amara's eyes locked on him. "Neither do you belong to a badge that permits you to harm without consequence. But here you are, and here I am. Perhaps it is time we all ask ourselves who belongs where." The crowd erupted again, some shouting, "That's right," while others clapped and stomped their feet. The officer stepped back, his face flushed, suddenly smaller than the uniform he wore. Her mother's voice echoed in Amara's mind again. "Stand tall, my child. Stand tall." And so she did. With a deep breath, Amara lifted the gavel, the symbol of authority that the judge had so often wielded to silence rather than to serve. She tapped it gently against the desk, not in anger, but in declaration. The sound rang out, sharp and clear. "This court is no longer a chamber of silence," she said. "It is a chamber of truth, and the truth will no longer be shackled." Some people wept openly. Others clenched their fists in solidarity. For the first time, the courtroom felt alive, not as a place of punishment, but as a place where the possibility of justice might be reborn. The prosecutor, pale and visibly shaken, muttered, "You'll be removed. This won't last." Amara met his eyes. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, this seat will no longer be reserved for those who see justice as a performance. One day, it will belong to the people, and no force on earth will stop that." Reporters whispered urgently into microphones, transmitting her words beyond the walls. Outside, crowds began to gather as news spread. People who had grown weary of shouting into the void now heard their voices echoed in hers. The judge, realizing he had lost command of the room, sank back into his chair. His authority, once unquestionable, now felt hollow. He watched her with a mixture of anger and fear, but also something else, something like recognition that he had just witnessed the beginning of a change he could not control. Amara looked across the gallery once more. Her eyes found the faces of ordinary people, mothers, fathers, young activists, and elders who had marched decades ago. They looked back at her with tears, with pride, with hope. She raised the gavel again, holding it high. "Justice will not be handed to us. It must be taken. Today, we have taken the first step." Image 20. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed again, and with it, a surge of energy coursed through the room. The gallery stood as one, voices rising together, no longer afraid to be heard. And for the first time in that courtroom's long history, justice did not wear the face of the system. It wore the face of a black woman who refused to be broken. Image 21. The courtroom no longer belonged to the state. It no longer belonged to the judge who sat slumped in humiliation, or the prosecutor whose carefully prepared arguments now seemed hollow. It belonged to the people, to those whose voices had been silenced for generations and who now, through Amara, found their voice echoing off the very walls that once smothered them. Image 22. News cameras rolled without pause, broadcasting the scene to a nation hungry for truth. On television screens across the country, people watched in disbelief as a young black woman, assaulted in plain sight by those sworn to uphold the law, now sat draped in the robe of justice itself. To some, it was unthinkable. To others, it was the sight they had been waiting for their entire lives. Amara knew the moment would not last forever. She knew the officers could move to drag her out at any second, that the law, as it was written, did not protect her here. But that was not the point. The point was that for this one moment, the truth could not be hidden. It stood in the open, undeniable, unstoppable. Her voice rose again, calm but resolute. For too long, this robe has been worn by men who wielded power but denied justice. Today, we show that justice is not a robe, not a title, not a privilege. It is a promise that belongs to every person who walks into this room, no matter the color of their skin, no matter the weight of their name. Image 23. The gallery erupted in applause once more, but this time it was not hesitant. It was loud, unapologetic, full of fire. Some people stood on the benches, fists raised high. Tears streamed down the faces of elders who had once marched with banners, who had once been beaten for demanding the simplest recognition of their humanity. They saw themselves in Amara. They saw the future in her. The prosecutor tried to shout over the noise, his voice cracking. "This is anarchy." Amara turned to him, her gaze cutting through his panic. "No, this is clarity. Anarchy is when justice is replaced by violence. Anarchy is when truth is silenced. Anarchy is when power is abused without consequence. What you see today is order finally being restored." The officer who had slapped her lowered his head. His uniform felt like a shackle now, heavy with shame. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, the shame of his action immortalized by every flashing camera. Amara lifted the gavel once more. "Let it be known, a slap meant to silence me became the spark that lit a fire, and no one here will ever forget it." The sound of the gavel striking the desk boomed like thunder, shaking the room. Outside, the crowd grew larger. People flooded the courthouse steps, holding signs, chanting her name. "Amara! Amara! Justice for all!" Their voices carried into the street, a chorus of unity that could not be ignored. Inside, Amara stood from the judge's chair. She removed the robe carefully and folded it over the bench, leaving it behind. She did not need the robe anymore. She had shown that authority lived not in the garment, but in the courage to speak truth. She turned to the gallery, her voice softer now, but just as commanding. "This moment is not about me. It is about us. Each of you carries the power to demand justice, to demand dignity, to demand truth. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for someone to hand it to you. Take it. It is yours." The people in the gallery rose to their feet. Some reached for her hand as she walked past them, and others simply bowed their heads in gratitude. The energy was electric, like history being rewritten in real time. The judge, unable to regain control, whispered to himself, "This will never stand. She will be arrested. The system will not allow this." But even he knew that whatever happened next, nothing could erase what had already taken place. The image of a black woman in the judge's chair, robe on her shoulders, truth on her tongue, that image would live forever. Amara stepped down from the bench and walked toward the doors of the courtroom. The officers hesitated. Their orders were unclear, their authority shaken. None dared to lay a hand on her again. The memory of that slap had transformed into a living symbol of their own corruption. When she pushed the doors open, the roar of the crowd outside swallowed the silence of the courtroom. People surged forward, not to smother her, but to shield her, to walk beside her, to carry her message into the streets. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but the only sound that mattered was the chant, "Justice now! Justice now!" Amara lifted her hand, not for silence, but for strength. She looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, and she smiled, not with triumph, but with resolve. "This is not the end," she declared, her voice carried by microphones and megaphones alike. "This is the beginning. Every step we take from this courthouse is a step toward a world where no one can be slapped into silence, where no one can be stripped of their dignity, where justice is not a stage, but a reality. Stand with me. Stand with each other. Stand for justice. The crowd roared in response, their voices echoing down the streets, bouncing off buildings, reaching ears far beyond the city. Somewhere, in a quiet living room, a young black girl watched the broadcast, her eyes wide with wonder. She saw Amara, regal and unbroken, and for the first time, she believed she, too, could stand tall in a world that tried to shrink her. Somewhere else, an elder sat in their chair, tears falling freely, whispering prayers of thanks that they had lived to see this day. And in countless hearts across the nation, something long dormant began to stir, hope, alive again. The officer who had struck her remained inside, head lowered, unable to face the movement he had inadvertently ignited. The judge sat in his chair, robe heavy on his shoulders, realizing that authority without respect was nothing but an empty costume. And the prosecutor, still clutching his papers, knew his words had been drowned out forever by a truth more powerful than any case he could present. Amara walked forward, the crowd parting around her like a river. She did not look back because she knew that what had been left behind would never be the same. A single act of violence had been transformed into a symbol of resilience. A single courtroom had become the birthplace of a movement. And somewhere in the air, carried on the chants and songs of the people, was the simple truth her mother had always told her. Stand tall, Amara. Stand tall. She did. And because she did, the world would never again sit quite as comfortably in silence. Subscribe.